Segment 1. The Roots of Resilience. A Humble Beginning. Desmond Mpilo Tutu, 1931 to 2021, was not born into privilege or power. Instead, his early years were marked by the quiet struggles of ordinary people trying to survive under extraordinary oppression. Born on October 7, 1931, in Klerksdorp, a small mining town in South Africa's Transvaal province, Tutu grew up in a racially segregated society where inequality wasn't just pervasive, but institutionalized. His father, Zachariah Zalilo Tutu, worked as a school teacher, instilling in young Desmond the value of education and intellectual curiosity. His mother, Aletta Tutu, labored as a domestic helper, embodying resilience and grace in the face of hardship. Together, they created a home filled with love, faith, and hope, despite the oppressive realities of apartheid. Imagine growing up in a world that tells you your worth is less than others simply because of the color of your skin. How does one rise above such dehumanization? For Desmond, the answer lay in the lessons he learned from his parents. His father's commitment to teaching underscored the transformative power of knowledge, while his mother's quiet strength taught him the importance of compassion and empathy. These values became the bedrock of Tutu's character, shaping his worldview and guiding his actions throughout his life. Klerksdorp, like much of South Africa during this period, was a microcosm of racial segregation. Black South Africans were relegated to inferior schools, denied access to quality healthcare, and forced to live in overcrowded townships far from urban centers. Yet, amidst these injustices, young Desmond found solace in the church. The Anglican faith offered him not only spiritual comfort, but also a moral framework for understanding the world around him. It was here, in the pews of St. Cyprian's Church, that Tutu first encountered the idea of humanity as a collective, a notion that would later evolve into his embrace of Ubuntu, the African philosophy of interconnectedness. But what truly set Tutu apart was his ability to see beyond the immediate suffering and envision a better future. Even as a child, he questioned the status quo, wondering why some people were treated as inferior while others enjoyed privileges they hadn't earned. Why should anyone be judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character? He might have asked himself. These questions lingered in his mind, planting the seeds of activism that would blossom decades later. As he grew older, Tutu faced challenges that tested his resolve. Unable to pursue his dream of becoming a doctor due to financial constraints, he turned to teaching, a profession that allowed him to nurture young minds and challenge systemic inequities within the education system. However, even this path was fraught with obstacles. The Bantu Education Act of 1953, designed to limit opportunities for black students, forced many educators, including Tutu, to confront the harsh realities of apartheid head-on. Rather than succumb to despair, Tutu channeled his frustration into action, using his position as a teacher to inspire critical thinking and foster a sense of agency among his students. It was during this time that Tutu began to realize the limitations of working within the system. If true change was to occur, it would require more than incremental reforms. It would demand a complete overhaul of the structures that perpetuated injustice. This realization led him to pursue theology, believing that faith could serve as both a source of personal strength and a catalyst for social transformation. Little did he know that this decision would set him on a path toward becoming one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. Segment 2. The Intersection of Faith and Activism. The journey from teacher to theologian marked a pivotal turning point in Desmond Tutu's life. In 1960, after completing his studies at St. Peter's Theological College in Johannesburg, Tutu was ordained as an Anglican priest. This moment was not merely a professional milestone. It was a profound affirmation of his calling to serve humanity through faith. For Tutu, being a clergyman was never about retreating from the world. It was about engaging with it more deeply, addressing its wounds, and advocating for justice. His theological education took him to London, where he earned a master's degree in theology. Studying abroad exposed Tutu to new ideas and perspectives, broadening his understanding of human rights, equality, and the role of religion in promoting social change. He returned to South Africa armed with not only academic credentials, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The church, he believed, had a moral obligation to stand against injustice and speak truth to power. Faith without works is dead, he often reminded himself. Drawing inspiration from biblical teachings, Tutu's approach to activism was deeply rooted in his Christian faith, which emphasized love, compassion, and justice for all humanity. Unlike some leaders who advocated for armed struggle, Tutu consistently promoted nonviolent resistance. He believed in the power of dialogue, peaceful protests, and international pressure to dismantle apartheid. His moral authority as a clergyman lent credibility to his calls for change, making him one of the most respected voices in the global fight against apartheid. One of the defining characteristics of Tutu's activism was his unwavering optimism. Even in the darkest moments, he refused to lose hope. "We must believe in miracles," he once said, "because history has shown us that what seems impossible today can become reality tomorrow." This belief in the possibility of change fueled his relentless advocacy for justice. Whether addressing crowds at rallies, speaking at international conferences, or writing impassioned letters to world leaders, Tutu's message was always clear. Apartheid was not just a South African problem. It was a human problem that demanded a global response. Segment 3. The Anti-Apartheid Movement. A Voice of Conscience. Desmond Tutu's emergence as a leading figure in the anti-apartheid movement was not an accident of history. It was the inevitable result of his deep moral convictions and unwavering commitment to justice. By the 1970s, apartheid had reached its zenith, entrenching racial segregation and economic exploitation to such an extent that South Africa became a pariah state on the global stage. The regime's brutal enforcement of discriminatory laws, such as passbooks, forced removals, and segregated education, left Black South Africans stripped of their dignity and basic human rights. Amid this climate of despair, Tutu stood as a beacon of hope, using his platform as a clergyman to challenge the system and inspire others to join the struggle. Tutu's activism was marked by a unique blend of courage and compassion. He understood that fighting apartheid required more than just anger. It demanded strategic thinking, moral clarity, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of change. Unlike some leaders who advocated for armed resistance, Tutu championed nonviolent methods, believing that love and dialogue could ultimately triumph over hatred and division. "The violence begets violence," he often said, "but love has the power to transform even the hardest hearts." This philosophy resonated deeply with those who sought a path forward without perpetuating cycles of retribution. One of Tutu's most significant contributions to the anti-apartheid movement was his role in mobilizing international support. Recognizing that internal pressure alone might not be enough to dismantle apartheid, he traveled extensively, speaking at universities, churches, and conferences around the world. His speeches were masterclasses in rhetoric, blending humor, indignation, and hope to galvanize audiences. He challenged governments, corporations, and individuals to take a stand against apartheid, urging them to impose economic sanctions and boycott South African goods. "If you are neutral in situations of injustice," he famously declared, "you have chosen the side of the oppressor." Tutu's advocacy extended beyond words. He openly defied apartheid laws, refusing to carry the mandatory passbooks that restricted the movement of Black South Africans. He also criticized the government's use of violence against activists, calling attention to atrocities like the Sharpeville massacre and the Soweto uprising. His willingness to confront the regime head-on made him a target of harassment and intimidation, but he remained undeterred. "They can jail my body," he once said, "but they cannot imprison my spirit." Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of Tutu's leadership was his ability to unite people across racial, cultural, and ideological divides. While many anti-apartheid activists focused primarily on mobilizing Black communities, Tutu recognized the importance of building alliances with white South Africans, international allies, and even moderate members of the apartheid government. He believed that reconciliation, not revenge, was the key to dismantling apartheid and creating a truly democratic society. This inclusive approach earned him both admiration and criticism. Some hardline activists accused him of being too moderate, while conservative elements within South Africa viewed him as a radical troublemaker. Yet, Tutu remained steadfast, guided by his principles and his faith. His efforts bore fruit in the mid-1980s, when international pressure began to mount against the apartheid regime. Economic sanctions imposed by countries around the world crippled South Africa's economy, forcing the government to reconsider its policies. In 1984, Tutu was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of his nonviolent efforts to end apartheid. The award brought unprecedented attention to the plight of Black South Africans and strengthened the global anti-apartheid movement. For Tutu, however, the prize was not about personal glory. It was a call to action. "This is not just my victory," he humbly remarked during his acceptance speech. "It belongs to all those who have suffered under apartheid and continue to fight for justice." Segment 4. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Healing a Broken Nation. When apartheid finally crumbled in the early 1990s, South Africa faced a daunting challenge: how to heal the wounds of decades of hatred and division. The transition from apartheid to democracy was fraught with tension, as many feared that the collapse of the regime would lead to widespread violence and chaos. It was in this precarious moment that Desmond Tutu stepped forward once again, offering a vision of reconciliation and forgiveness that would shape the nation's future. In 1995, Nelson Mandela appointed Tutu as chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, a groundbreaking initiative designed to address the atrocities committed during the apartheid era. The TRC's mandate was twofold: to uncover the truth about human rights violations and to promote national healing through amnesty for those who confess their crimes. It was a radical idea, one that prioritized transparency and accountability over vengeance. But Tutu believed it was the only way to build a united and peaceful South Africa. The TRC hearings were emotionally charged events, bringing victims and perpetrators face to face in a public forum. Survivors recounted harrowing stories of torture, imprisonment, and loss, while former security forces and collaborators admitted to acts of brutality. These testimonies were painful to hear, yet they served a crucial purpose. They exposed the full extent of apartheid's horrors and acknowledged the suffering of those who had been silenced for so long. "We cannot move forward until we confront the past," Tutu often said, emphasizing the importance of truth-telling in the process of healing. For Tutu, forgiveness was not about excusing wrongdoing. It was about breaking the cycle of hatred and creating space for renewal. He believed that acknowledging guilt and expressing remorse could pave the way for genuine reconciliation. This philosophy was rooted in Ubuntu, the African worldview that emphasizes interconnectedness and shared humanity. "I am because we are," Tutu explained, capturing the essence of this belief. In practicing forgiveness, individuals were not only freeing themselves from bitterness, but also contributing to the restoration of the community. The TRC was not without its controversies. Some critics argued that granting amnesty to perpetrators undermined justice, while others felt that the commission failed to hold high-ranking officials accountable for their roles in apartheid-era crimes. Despite these criticisms, the TRC remains one of Tutu's most enduring contributions, a testament to the power of dialogue and empathy in resolving conflict. It demonstrated that reconciliation is not a passive act. It requires courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to embrace discomfort. Even after the TRC concluded its work, Tutu continued to advocate for forgiveness and healing. He believed that reconciliation was an ongoing process, one that required vigilance and commitment from all sectors of society. "We must never forget the lessons of our past," he cautioned, "but we must also look to the future with hope and determination." His leadership during this critical period solidified his reputation as a moral giant, someone whose wisdom and compassion transcended politics and ideology. Segment 5. Post-apartheid contributions. a lifelong commitment to justice. While many might have chosen to retire after playing such a pivotal role in ending apartheid, Desmond Tutu refused to rest on his laurels. Even in his later years, he remained a tireless advocate for social justice, addressing issues ranging from poverty and inequality to HIV/AIDS and climate change. For Tutu, the end of apartheid was not the conclusion of the struggle. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter in the quest for equity and dignity. One of Tutu's primary concerns in the post-apartheid era was the persistence of poverty and inequality. Despite the formal abolition of apartheid, South Africa continued to grapple with stark disparities in wealth, education, and healthcare. Black South Africans, who constituted the majority of the population, still faced significant barriers to upward mobility. Tutu saw this as a betrayal of the promises made during the transition to democracy. Freedom without bread is meaningless, he argued, highlighting the need for economic reforms that would benefit the most marginalized communities. HIV/AIDS was another issue that consumed much of Tutu's attention in the late 1990s and early 2000s. At the time, South Africa was experiencing one of the highest rates of HIV infection in the world, yet the government's response was woefully inadequate. President Thabo Mbeki's denialism regarding the link between HIV and AIDS exacerbated the crisis, leaving millions without access to life-saving treatments. Tutu spoke out forcefully against this negligence, calling on the government to prioritize public health and provide antiretroviral drugs to those in need. His advocacy helped shift the national conversation, eventually leading to improved policies and increased funding for HIV/AIDS programs. Climate change emerged as another pressing concern for Tutu in his later years. Recognizing the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation on poor and vulnerable populations, he framed climate justice as a moral imperative. "The Earth does not belong to us," he reminded audiences. "We belong to the Earth." Tutu joined global campaigns to combat climate change, urging world leaders to adopt sustainable practices and reduce carbon emissions. He also called attention to the ethical dimensions of environmental policy, emphasizing the need to protect the planet for future generations. Throughout all of these endeavors, Tutu maintained his characteristic blend of optimism and realism. He understood that progress often comes slowly and unevenly, requiring patience and perseverance. Yet, he never lost sight of the bigger picture, the belief that humanity is capable of extraordinary things when we come together with a shared vision of justice and compassion. "We are made for goodness," he often said, echoing his faith in the inherent potential of every individual to contribute to the betterment of society. Segment 6. The Philosophy of Ubuntu, a Blueprint for Humanity, at the heart of Desmond. Tutu's philosophy lies Ubuntu, a profound African worldview that encapsulates the essence of interconnectedness and shared humanity. For Tutu, Ubuntu was not merely an abstract concept. It was a guiding principle that shaped his approach to life, leadership, and activism. "I am because we are," he often said, distilling the essence of this philosophy into a simple, yet powerful phrase. In a world increasingly fragmented by division, inequality, and conflict, Ubuntu offers a blueprint for how we might reimagine our relationships with one another and the world around us. Ubuntu challenges the individualistic ethos that dominates much of modern society. It reminds us that no person exists in isolation, that our identities, actions, and well-being are deeply intertwined with those of others. This interconnectedness extends beyond immediate family or community to encompass all of humanity. For Tutu, Ubuntu was a call to recognize the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, regardless of race, class, gender, or nationality. It demanded that we see ourselves in others and act accordingly, fostering empathy, compassion, and solidarity. Tutu's embrace of Ubuntu was rooted in his Christian faith, which emphasizes love, humility, and service to others. He saw Ubuntu as a universal truth, one that transcended cultural and religious boundaries. Whether addressing audiences in South Africa, Europe, or North America. He spoke of Ubuntu as a lens through which we could understand our shared humanity. "We are all God's children," he would say, invoking both spiritual and secular frameworks to make his point. This inclusivity allowed him to connect with diverse audiences and inspire collective action. One of the most compelling aspects of Ubuntu is its emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation. In a world where cycles of violence and retribution often seem endless, Ubuntu offers an alternative path, one grounded in healing and restoration. For Tutu, forgiveness was not about excusing wrongdoing, but about breaking free from the chains of bitterness and hatred. It required courage and vulnerability, qualities he believed were essential for personal and societal transformation. "Forgiveness says you are given another chance to make a new beginning," he once remarked, highlighting the redemptive power of this practice. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, exemplified Ubuntu in action. By bringing victims and perpetrators together in a spirit of openness and accountability, the TRC sought to heal the wounds of apartheid and lay the foundation for a more just and equitable society. While the process was far from perfect, it demonstrated the potential of Ubuntu to bridge divides and foster understanding. Tutu's leadership during this period underscored his belief that reconciliation is not a passive act. It requires active participation and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Ubuntu also informed Tutu's views on leadership and governance. He believed that true leaders must serve their communities with humility and integrity, prioritizing the common good over personal gain. "Leadership is not about titles or positions," he often said. "It is about serving others and leaving the world better than you found it." This servant leadership model resonated deeply with those who sought ethical alternatives to the corrupt and self-serving practices that characterized many governments and institutions. In reflecting on Ubuntu, Tutu challenged us to rethink our assumptions about success, happiness, and fulfillment. He argued that these concepts cannot be measured solely in terms of material wealth or individual achievement. Instead, they are rooted in our ability to contribute to the well-being of others and the broader community. "What gives life meaning," he suggested, "is not what we take, but what we give." This perspective invites us to consider how we might live more intentionally, aligning our actions with values of generosity, kindness, and justice. Segment 7. Forgiveness over retribution. The moral imperative. Desmond Tutu's advocacy for forgiveness over retribution stands as one of the most enduring aspects of his legacy. In a world where vengeance often seems like the natural response to injustice, Tutu dared to propose a different path, one rooted in compassion, empathy, and the belief in humanity's capacity for redemption. His insistence on forgiveness was not born out of naivety or weakness. Rather, it stemmed from a deep conviction that revenge perpetuates cycles of violence, while forgiveness opens the door to healing and renewal. To understand Tutu's stance on forgiveness, we must first grapple with the enormity of the injustices perpetrated under apartheid. For decades, Black South Africans endured unimaginable suffering, forced removals, torture, imprisonment, and even death, all sanctioned by a regime built on racial supremacy. The scars left by these atrocities ran deep, affecting not only individuals, but entire communities. When apartheid finally ended, there was a palpable fear that the transition to democracy might descend into chaos, as victims sought retribution against their oppressors. Tutu recognized that pursuing justice through vengeance would only deepen the divisions that had plagued South Africa for so long. Instead, he proposed a radical alternative: forgiveness. He believed that acknowledging guilt and expressing remorse could pave the way for genuine reconciliation. This approach was not about forgetting the past or absolving perpetrators of responsibility. Rather, it was about creating space for dialogue, understanding, and ultimately, healing. Without forgiveness, he warned, there can be no future. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, embodied this philosophy. By offering amnesty to those who confess their crimes, The TRC provided a mechanism for accountability without resorting to punitive measures. Victims were given a platform to share their stories, ensuring that their voices were heard and their pain acknowledged. Perpetrators, meanwhile, were encouraged to confront the consequences of their actions and seek redemption. While the process was fraught with emotion and controversy, it succeeded in fostering a sense of closure for many participants. Tutu's emphasis on forgiveness extended beyond the TRC to his broader vision of social justice. He believed that forgiveness was not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for building sustainable peace. In a country as diverse and divided as South Africa, clinging to anger and resentment would have been a recipe for disaster. By choosing forgiveness, South Africans took a crucial step toward forging a new national identity, one based on mutual respect and cooperation. Critics of Tutu's approach argue that forgiveness risks undermining justice, particularly when it comes to holding high-ranking officials accountable for systemic crimes. They contend that granting amnesty to perpetrators allows them to evade punishment, potentially eroding public trust in the legal system. While these concerns are valid, Tutu countered that forgiveness and justice are not mutually exclusive. True justice, he argued, involves restoring relationships and rebuilding communities, not simply punishing wrongdoers. Justice without reconciliation is hollow, he insisted, emphasizing the need for balance between accountability and compassion. 4. Tutu, forgiveness was also a deeply personal practice. Having witnessed the horrors of apartheid firsthand, he understood the temptation to harbor anger and resentment. Yet, he chose to rise above these emotions, believing that doing so was essential for his own well-being and that of others. Holding on to bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, he quipped, using humor to drive home a serious point. His example serves as a reminder that forgiveness is not just an act of grace toward others. It is also a gift we give ourselves. Segment 8. Challenges and criticisms. A life under scrutiny. Despite his immense contributions to the fight against apartheid and his role in shaping post-apartheid South Africa, Desmond Tutu faced numerous challenges and criticisms throughout his life. These critiques came from various quarters. Hardline activists who viewed him as too moderate, conservative elements within South Africa who dismissed him as a radical troublemaker, and even some allies who questioned his methods and decisions. Yet, through it all, Tutu remained steadfast, guided by his principles and his unwavering commitment to justice. One of the most persistent criticisms leveled against Tutu was his advocacy for nonviolent resistance. While many admired his moral clarity and strategic acumen, others felt that peaceful methods were insufficient to dismantle a regime as entrenched and brutal as apartheid. Some anti-apartheid activists, particularly those aligned with organizations like the African National Congress, ANC, believed that armed struggle was necessary to achieve meaningful change. They argued that nonviolence amounted to appeasement, allowing the apartheid government to maintain its grip on power. Tutu, however, maintained that violence only perpetuated cycles of hatred and destruction, ultimately undermining the very goals it sought to achieve. Peaceful resistance is not weakness, he countered. It is strength tempered by wisdom. Another source of criticism came from within the ANC itself, particularly after the end of apartheid. As chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, Tutu made several controversial decisions that drew ire from various factions. Some accused him of being too lenient toward former apartheid officials, arguing that granting amnesty to perpetrators undermined justice for victims. Others felt that the TRC failed to hold high-ranking members of the apartheid regime accountable for their roles in orchestrating systemic crimes. While Tutu acknowledged these shortcomings, he defended the Commission's work as a necessary compromise, a pragmatic solution to a complex and emotionally charged situation. Perfection is not attainable, he admitted, but progress is possible if we remain committed to the greater good. Tutu's outspoken nature also earned him enemies, both domestically and internationally. He was unafraid to criticize corruption and mismanagement within the post-apartheid government, including during the presidencies of Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma. His vocal opposition to Mbeki's denialism regarding HIV/AIDS, for instance, placed him at odds with the ruling party. Similarly, his calls for greater transparency and accountability in governance alienated some ANC leaders who viewed his interventions as meddling. Despite these tensions, Tutu refused to back down, insisting that his duty as a moral leader was to speak truth to power, even when it meant facing backlash. Health issues further complicated Tutu's later years. Diagnosed with prostate cancer in the late 1990s, he underwent multiple treatments and surgeries, enduring significant physical and emotional strain. Yet, even as his body weakened, his spirit remained indomitable. He continued to advocate for causes close to his heart, traveling extensively despite his declining health. "My illness has taught me patience and gratitude," he reflected, finding meaning even in adversity. His resilience in the face of personal struggles served as an inspiration to millions, reinforcing his status as a symbol of hope and perseverance. Perhaps the greatest testament to Tutu's character lies in how he responded to criticism. Rather than lashing out or retreating into silence, he engaged with his detractors openly and respectfully, seeking common ground wherever possible. He understood that disagreement was inevitable in any movement for change, but he believed that constructive dialogue could bridge divides and strengthen alliances. "We don't have to agree on everything to work together," he often said, embodying the spirit of Ubuntu in his interactions with others. Segment 9. Global Influence, a voice that transcended borders. Desmond Tutu's impact was not confined to the borders of South Africa. His voice resonated across continents, inspiring movements for justice, peace, and human rights around the world. While his primary focus remained the dismantling of apartheid and the healing of post-apartheid South Africa, his moral authority and universal message transcended national boundaries, making him a global icon for those fighting against oppression and inequality. Tutu's international influence began to take shape in the 1980s, as he traveled extensively to raise awareness about apartheid and mobilize support for sanctions against the South African regime. His speeches at universities, churches, and conferences captivated audiences with their blend of humor, indignation, and hope. He had a rare ability to connect with people from all walks of life, whether addressing heads of state or grassroots activists. The struggle against apartheid is not just a South African issue. He often reminded his listeners, it is a human issue that demands a global response. One of the most significant milestones in Tutu's global advocacy came in 1984, when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The honor brought unprecedented attention to the anti-apartheid movement, galvanizing international efforts to isolate the apartheid regime economically and politically. For Tutu, the prize was both a validation of his work and a call to action. "This is not my victory," he humbly remarked during his acceptance speech. "It belongs to all those who have suffered under apartheid and continue to fight for justice." His words underscored the collective nature of the struggle, emphasizing that no single individual could claim credit for progress achieved through unity and perseverance. Beyond apartheid, Tutu's influence extended to a wide range of global issues, including poverty, HIV/AIDS, climate change, and human rights. He became a vocal advocate for debt relief for developing nations, arguing that crippling financial obligations perpetuated cycles of poverty and hindered development. At the G8 summit in 2005, he joined forces with organizations like Jubilee Debt Campaign to push for the cancellation of debts owed by impoverished countries. How can we expect these nations to thrive when they are burdened by insurmountable debt? He asked, challenging world leaders to prioritize compassion over profit. HIV/AIDS was another area where Tutu played a pivotal role on the global stage. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, South Africa faced one of the highest rates of HIV infection in the world. Yet the government's response was marred by denialism and neglect. President Thabo Mbeki's refusal to acknowledge the link between HIV and AIDS exacerbated the crisis, leaving millions without access to life-saving treatments. Tutu spoke out forcefully against this negligence, calling on the government to adopt evidence-based policies and provide antiretroviral drugs to those in need. His advocacy helped shift the national conversation, eventually leading to improved healthcare infrastructure and increased funding for HIV/AIDS programs. Internationally, he worked with organizations like UNAIDS and the Global Fund to combat the epidemic, emphasizing the ethical imperative of addressing health disparities. Climate change emerged as another pressing concern for Tutu in his later years. Recognizing the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation on poor and vulnerable populations, he framed climate justice as a moral issue. "The Earth does not belong to us," he reminded audiences. "We belong to the Earth." Tutu joined global campaigns to combat climate change, urging world leaders to adopt sustainable practices and reduce carbon emissions. He also called attention to the ethical dimensions of environmental policy, emphasizing the need to protect the planet for future generations. His involvement in initiatives like the Elders, a group of independent global leaders founded by Nelson Mandela, further amplified his advocacy, positioning him as a champion for intergenerational equity and ecological stewardship. Tutu's global influence was also evident in his role as a mentor and role model for younger generations of activists. He inspired countless individuals and movements worldwide, proving that courage and compassion could ignite change on a massive scale. From the civil rights movement in the United States to pro-democracy protests in Myanmar, Tutu's example demonstrated that nonviolent resistance and moral leadership were powerful tools for challenging injustice. Change begins with ordinary people doing extraordinary things, he often said, encouraging others to believe in their capacity to make a difference. Even in retirement, Tutu remained a vocal critic of global injustices, speaking out against issues such as Islamophobia, xenophobia, and authoritarianism. He believed that silence in the face of oppression was complicity, urging people everywhere to stand up for what is right. "If you are neutral in situations of injustice," he famously declared, "you have chosen the side of the oppressor." This mantra became a rallying cry for activists around the world, reinforcing the idea that apathy is a luxury we cannot afford. Segment 10. Reflections on Morality and Spirituality. A Life Guided by Faith. At the core of Desmond Tutu's activism and philosophy lay a deep spiritual conviction that guided every aspect of his life. For Tutu, faith was not a private matter, but a public calling, a mandate to serve humanity with love, humility, and integrity. His Christian beliefs provided the moral framework for his advocacy, shaping his views on justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Yet, his spirituality was inclusive, transcending religious and cultural boundaries to embrace universal principles of compassion and interconnectedness. Tutu often described himself as a prisoner of hope, a phrase that encapsulated his unwavering belief in the possibility of redemption and renewal. Despite witnessing the horrors of apartheid and grappling with personal struggles, he refused to succumb to despair. "Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase," he liked to say, quoting Martin Luther King, Jr. This metaphor perfectly captured his approach to life, trusting in the journey, even when the destination seemed uncertain. Central to Tutu's spirituality was the concept of Ubuntu, which he saw as a reflection of divine love. For him, Ubuntu was not just an African philosophy, but a manifestation of God's presence in the world. It reminded him that every person is created in the image of God and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. "We are made for goodness," he often proclaimed, echoing his belief in humanity's inherent potential to contribute to the betterment of society. This optimism was rooted in his faith, which taught him that love and grace are more powerful than hatred and division. Tutu's reflections on morality were equally profound. He believed that true leadership requires humility and service, qualities he associated with Jesus Christ. "The Son of Man came not to be served but to serve," he frequently quoted from the Bible, using this verse to emphasize the importance of servant leadership. For Tutu, leaders must prioritize the common good over personal gain. acting as stewards rather than rulers. This perspective informed his critiques of corruption and inequality, both within South Africa and globally. He challenged those in positions of power to use their influence responsibly, reminding them that authority comes with accountability. Spirituality also played a crucial role in Tutu's practice of forgiveness. He understood that forgiving others is not easy. It requires surrendering anger and resentment, emotions that can feel justified in the face of injustice. Yet, he believed that forgiveness is essential for personal and societal healing. Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. He once said, borrowing a metaphor to illustrate the transformative power of grace. For Tutu, forgiveness was not about excusing wrongdoing, but about freeing oneself from the burden of bitterness. It was an act of liberation, allowing individuals to move forward with renewed purpose and hope. In reflecting on his own faith journey, Tutu acknowledged moments of doubt and struggle. He admitted that there were times when he questioned God's plan, particularly in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Yet, he found solace in prayer and community, drawing strength from the shared experiences of others. Faith is not the absence of fear, he explained. It is the courage to act despite it. This insight resonated deeply with those who sought guidance in navigating their own challenges, offering a reminder that faith is not about having all the answers but about trusting in the process. Tutu's spirituality also informed his views on death and legacy. As he grew older and faced declining health, he approached mortality with remarkable grace and humor. "When I die," he joked, "I want to be remembered as someone who loved laughter and made people smile." While he cherished lightheartedness, he also took seriously the responsibility of leaving behind a meaningful legacy. He hoped that his life would inspire others to pursue justice and compassion, carrying forward the torch of Ubuntu long after he was gone. "Do your little bit of good where you are," he advised. "It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world." Segment 11. Legacy and Enduring Impact. A Beacon of Hope. Desmond. Tutu's legacy is vast and multifaceted, touching countless lives and leaving an indelible mark on history. His contributions to the anti-apartheid movement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, and global advocacy for social justice have cemented his status as a moral giant. Yet, perhaps his greatest legacy lies in the values he embodied: courage, compassion, forgiveness, and interconnectedness, and the inspiration he continues to provide to future generations. The TRC remains one of Tutu's most enduring achievements, serving as a model for other countries grappling with legacies of violence and oppression. Nations like Rwanda, Northern Ireland, and Colombia have drawn lessons from South Africa's experience, adapting the principles of truth-telling and reconciliation to their own contexts. While the TRC was not without its flaws, it demonstrated the potential of forgiveness and dialogue to heal divided societies. Reconciliation is not cheap, Tutu cautioned. It requires hard work and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. This wisdom continues to guide efforts toward peace-building and transitional justice worldwide. Tutu's influence extends beyond formal institutions to the realm of grassroots activism. His example has inspired countless individuals and movements, from pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong to climate strikes led by young people around the globe. For many, Tutu represents the archetype of the moral leader, someone who speaks truth to power, stands firm in their convictions, and leads with humility and grace. "You don't have to be extraordinary to make a difference," he often reminded audiences. "Ordinary people doing ordinary things can create extraordinary change." His legacy is also evident in the ongoing pursuit of social justice within South Africa and beyond. While the country has made significant strides since the end of apartheid, challenges such as poverty, inequality, and corruption persist. Tutu's calls for economic reform, transparency, and accountability remain relevant, serving as a roadmap for addressing these issues. His emphasis on Ubuntu continues to shape debates about identity, belonging, and community, offering a counter-narrative to the divisive rhetoric that dominates much of contemporary discourse. On a personal level, Tutu's life serves as a testament to the power of resilience and perseverance. Despite facing immense adversity, both as a black man living under apartheid and as an activist challenging entrenched systems of power, he never lost sight of his vision for a better world. His ability to find joy and humor even in the darkest moments reminds us that hope is a choice, one that can sustain us through life's trials. Laughter is God's gift to us, he once said. It connects us to each other and to the divine. As we reflect on Desmond Tutu's legacy, we are reminded of the transformative power of love and compassion. He showed us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. He taught us that forgiveness is not weakness, but strength, capable of breaking cycles of hatred and fostering healing. And he proved that interconnectedness is not just a philosophical ideal, but a practical necessity for building a more just and equitable world. In honoring Tutu's memory, let us strive to embody the values he championed. Let us be architects of change, builders of bridges, and carriers of light. After all, isn't that what true leadership looks like? In a world still grappling with inequality and division, Desmond Tutu's example serves as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, change is possible when people come together with a shared vision of justice and humanity. Segment 12. Case Studies of Influence. How Tutu Shaped Movements. Worldwide. Desmond Tutu's influence extended far beyond South Africa, leaving an indelible mark on social justice movements across the globe. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance, forgiveness, and interconnectedness inspired activists in diverse contexts, from civil rights struggles in the United States to pro-democracy movements in Asia and Africa. By examining specific case studies, we can better understand how Tutu's ideas were adapted and applied to address unique challenges in different parts of the world. The civil rights movement in the United States. While Desmond Tutu was not directly involved in the American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, his work resonated deeply with its leaders and principles. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks had already laid the groundwork for nonviolent resistance as a tool for dismantling systemic racism. However, Tutu's later advocacy reinforced these principles, offering a contemporary example of how peaceful protest could achieve transformative results. In the 1980s, Tutu became a prominent figure in the anti-apartheid movement within the United States. College campuses, churches, and community organizations rallied around the call for divestment from companies doing business in apartheid-era South Africa. Students organized sit-ins, marches, and boycotts, drawing parallels between the struggles against apartheid and Jim Crow segregation. Tutu's speeches during this period provided moral clarity and urgency, helping to galvanize support for sanctions and boycotts. "What happens in South Africa affects us all," he often said, emphasizing the interconnectedness of global struggles for justice. Tutu's emphasis on forgiveness also found echoes in post-civil rights America. As the nation grappled with issues of racial reconciliation following decades of segregation and discrimination, Tutu's leadership of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, offered valuable lessons. Initiatives like the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission in North Carolina, established in 2004 to address the 1979 massacre of labor organizers, drew inspiration from South Africa's TRC. These efforts highlighted the importance of acknowledging past wrongs and fostering dialogue as a means of healing divisions. Rwanda's post-genocide healing process. One of the most striking examples of Tutu's influence is Rwanda's approach to post-genocide reconciliation. After the horrific events of 1994, when nearly 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed in just 100 days, Rwanda faced the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered society. The government turned to models of transitional justice, including South Africa's TRC, as a framework for addressing the atrocities. While Rwanda ultimately adopted a different mechanism, the Gacaca courts, which relied on traditional community-based justice systems. Tutu's emphasis on forgiveness and accountability played a crucial role in shaping the discourse. Leaders in Rwanda recognized that punishing perpetrators alone would not suffice. Healing required acknowledgement of guilt, expressions of remorse, and opportunities for victims to share their stories. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, Tutu once said. It means remembering without being consumed by hatred. This insight resonated deeply with Rwandans, many of whom sought ways to coexist peacefully despite the trauma of the past. Tutu himself visited Rwanda multiple times, offering guidance and encouragement to those working toward reconciliation. His presence served as a reminder that forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, but a courageous act that paves the way for renewal. Today, Rwanda stands as a testament to the possibility of rebuilding trust and fostering unity after unimaginable violence, a legacy that owes much to Tutu's vision. Northern Ireland's peace process. The Troubles in Northern Ireland, a decades-long conflict rooted in religious and political divisions, presented another context where Tutu's philosophy proved influential. While the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 marked a significant step toward peace, the process of reconciliation remained fraught with tension. Communities divided along Catholic-Protestant lines struggled to overcome mutual distrust and animosity. Tutu's advocacy for truth-telling and forgiveness offered a roadmap for navigating these challenges. He participated in dialogues with leaders from both sides, emphasizing the importance of empathy and understanding. We are all God's children, he reminded them, urging them to see their shared humanity beneath sectarian divides. His message resonated with grassroots initiatives aimed at fostering cross-community relationships, such as integrated education programs and joint commemorations of victims. The success of Northern Ireland's peace process underscores the value of Tutu's approach. By prioritizing dialogue over division and compassion over retribution, communities were able to lay the groundwork for lasting peace. While challenges remain, the progress achieved demonstrates the enduring relevance of Tutu's teachings. Climate justice movements. In recent years, Tutu's legacy has inspired a new generation of activists focused on climate justice. Young leaders like Greta Thunberg and Vanessa Nakate have drawn parallels between environmental degradation and systemic inequality, framing climate change as a moral issue that disproportionately affects marginalized communities. Tutu's emphasis on Ubuntu, our interconnectedness with one another and the planet, resonates deeply with this perspective. Tutu's involvement in campaigns like the Elders, a group of independent global leaders advocating for peace and human rights, further amplified his impact on climate justice. Through this platform, he called attention to the ethical dimensions of environmental policy, challenging world leaders to prioritize sustainability and equity. "The Earth is our home," he often said. "We must protect it for future generations." This message continues to inspire activists worldwide, who view the fight against climate change as inseparable from the broader struggle for social justice. Segment 13. Philosophical Contributions. A Legacy of Thought. Leadership. Desmond Tutu's contributions to philosophy extend beyond his activism, offering profound insights into morality, ethics, and the human condition. His reflections on forgiveness, interconnectedness, and justice provide a rich intellectual foundation for addressing some of the most pressing challenges of our time. Forgiveness as a path to liberation. Tutu's advocacy for forgiveness challenges conventional notions of justice, which often equate accountability with punishment. He argued that true justice involves restoring relationships and rebuilding communities, rather than simply exacting retribution. "Forgiveness says you are given another chance to make a new beginning," he explained, highlighting the redemptive power of this practice. This philosophy has implications not only for post-conflict societies, but also for interpersonal relationships. In a world increasingly polarized by ideological differences, Tutu's emphasis on forgiveness offers a pathway toward bridging divides. By choosing to forgive, individuals can break free from cycles of resentment and open themselves to the possibility of reconciliation. Holding on to bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, he quipped. using humor to drive home a serious point. Ubuntu as a framework for global ethics. Ubuntu, the African worldview that emphasizes interconnectedness, lies at the heart of Tutu's philosophical contributions. For him, Ubuntu was not just a cultural concept, but a universal principle that transcended borders and identities. It reminded us that our well-being is tied to the well-being of others, fostering a sense of responsibility and solidarity. In today's hyper-individualistic world, Ubuntu offers a counter-narrative that prioritizes collective flourishing over personal gain. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about success, happiness, and fulfillment, encouraging us to measure these concepts not in terms of material wealth, but in terms of our ability to contribute to the greater good. What gives life meaning, Tutu suggested, is not what we take, but what we give. Justice as restoration. Tutu's approach to justice reflects a restorative rather than punitive paradigm. He believed that addressing harm requires more than punishing offenders. It demands repairing the damage done and reintegrating individuals into the community. This perspective aligns with emerging trends in criminal justice reform, which emphasize rehabilitation and reconciliation over incarceration and isolation. Restorative justice has gained traction in various contexts, from school discipline policies to prison reform initiatives. By focusing on accountability and healing, these approaches aim to reduce recidivism and foster safer, more cohesive communities. Tutu's advocacy for this model underscores the importance of addressing root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Segment 14. Personal Reflections. Lessons from a Life Well Lived. As we reflect on Desmond Tutu's life and legacy, we are reminded of the timeless lessons he imparted through his words and actions. His unwavering commitment to justice, his capacity for forgiveness, and his belief in humanity's potential to transcend division offer invaluable guidance for navigating the complexities of our modern world. Courage in the face of adversity. Tutu's courage serves as a powerful example of how to confront injustice without succumbing to despair. Whether defying apartheid laws or challenging corrupt governments, he demonstrated that standing up for what is right requires resilience and determination. Do your little bit of good where you are, he advised, reminding us that even small acts of kindness can create ripples of change. Humility as a leadership virtue. For Tutu, leadership was not about titles or positions, but about serving others with humility and integrity. He believed that true leaders must prioritize the common good over personal gain, acting as stewards rather than rulers. This servant leadership model remains relevant for anyone seeking to effect positive change, whether in politics, business, or community organizing. Hope as a catalyst for action. Above all, Tutu's life teaches us the transformative power of hope. Despite witnessing the horrors of apartheid and grappling with personal struggles, he never lost faith in the possibility of redemption and renewal. Hope is being able to see that there is light despite all the darkness, he once said, capturing the essence of his optimism. This hope is not passive, it is active, inspiring us to take bold steps toward a better future. Segment 15. Literary Contributions. A Voice Through Words. Desmond Tutu's influence extended beyond his speeches and activism into the realm of literature, where his writings continue to inspire readers worldwide. Through books, essays, and letters, Tutu articulated his philosophy, shared personal reflections, and provided guidance for those seeking to navigate the complexities of justice, forgiveness, and humanity. His literary contributions serve as a lasting testament to his intellectual depth and moral clarity. No Future Without Forgiveness. A testament to reconciliation. One of Tutu's most celebrated works, No Future Without Forgiveness, 1999, offers an intimate account of his experiences chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. The book is both a memoir and a philosophical exploration of forgiveness, detailing the emotional and ethical challenges faced during the TRC hearings. Tutu reflects on the power of storytelling, emphasizing how sharing personal narratives can foster empathy and understanding. In this work, Tutu grapples with difficult questions about accountability, amnesty, and healing. He acknowledges the imperfections of the TRC process while defending its core principles. Forgiveness is not forgetting, he writes. It is remembering without being consumed by hatred. These words encapsulate the delicate balance between acknowledging past wrongs and moving forward with hope. For readers, No Future Without Forgiveness serves as a guide for addressing historical injustices in their own contexts, whether at the national or interpersonal level. God Has a Dream. A Vision of Ubuntu, another seminal text. God Has a Dream. A Vision of Hope for Our Time, 2004, delves into Tutu's spiritual convictions and his belief in humanity's capacity for goodness. Drawing on biblical teachings and African traditions, he articulates a vision of a world rooted in love, compassion, and interconnectedness. The title itself reflects Tutu's optimism, suggesting that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of renewal. In this book, Tutu expands on the concept of Ubuntu, framing it as a universal ethic that transcends cultural and religious boundaries. He challenges readers to embrace their shared humanity, urging them to see themselves in others and act accordingly. We are made for goodness, he declares, echoing his faith in the inherent potential of every individual to contribute to the betterment of society. This message resonates deeply in a world increasingly divided by fear and mistrust, offering a hopeful alternative grounded in empathy and solidarity. Essays and Letters. A lifelong dialogue. Throughout his life, Tutu contributed numerous essays and letters to newspapers, journals, and magazines, addressing a wide range of topics from apartheid to climate change. These pieces reflect his ability to distill complex issues into accessible language, making his ideas accessible to diverse audiences, whether critiquing government policies or advocating for global causes. Tutu's writing consistently combines indignation with hope, challenging readers to confront injustice while believing in the possibility of change. One notable example is his open letter to the G8 leaders in 2005, co-authored with other members of the elders. In it, Tutu calls for urgent action on poverty, HIV/AIDS, and climate change, framing these issues as moral imperatives. The gap between rich and poor is not just an economic problem, he argues. It is a crisis of conscience. Such writings highlight Tutu's commitment to using his platform to amplify marginalized voices and hold those in power accountable. Segment 16. Interactions with Global Leaders. Building Bridges. Across Divides. Desmond. Tutu's relationships with global leaders underscored his role as a bridge builder, someone who could transcend ideological and political divides to foster dialogue and collaboration. His interactions with figures such as Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, and the Dalai Lama reveal the depth of his diplomatic acumen and his ability to inspire unity amid diversity. Nelson Mandela. A Partnership for Freedom. Tutu's friendship with Nelson Mandela was one of the most iconic partnerships in modern history. Both men played pivotal roles in dismantling apartheid and shaping post-apartheid South Africa. Yet their approaches complemented rather than competed with each other. While Mandela embodied resilience and pragmatism, Tutu brought moral authority and spiritual insight to the struggle. Their collaboration reached its zenith during the transition to democracy, when Mandela appointed Tutu as chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. Despite occasional disagreements over strategy, the two men shared a deep commitment to reconciliation and nation-building. The Madiba taught us the power of forgiveness, Tutu once said, referring to Mandela by his clan name. He showed us that no matter how deep the wounds, healing is possible if we choose love over hate. Barack Obama. A Meeting of Minds. Tutu's relationship with Barack Obama exemplifies the intergenerational impact of his leadership. As a young man, Obama was inspired by Tutu's advocacy for justice and equality, viewing him as a model of moral courage. When Obama became the first black president of the United States, Tutu expressed pride in his achievement, seeing it as a vindication of the broader struggle against racism and discrimination. The two men met on several occasions, discussing issues ranging from human rights to climate change. During one memorable encounter, Obama described Tutu as a hero whose wisdom had guided him throughout his career. For his part, Tutu praised Obama's leadership while encouraging him to remain steadfast in pursuing progressive policies. "You have been given a great gift," Tutu told him. "Use it wisely to uplift the downtrodden and protect the vulnerable." The Dalai Lama, a friendship rooted in spirituality. Perhaps one of Tutu's most cherished friendships was with the Dalai Lama, the exiled Tibetan spiritual leader. Despite coming from different religious traditions, Christianity and Buddhism, the two men found common ground in their commitment to peace, compassion, and human dignity. Their playful banter and mutual admiration endeared them to audiences around the world. Together, they co-authored The Book of Joy, Lasting Happiness in a Changing World, 2016, which explores the nature of joy and how to cultivate it in the face of adversity. The book captures their lively conversations, blending humor, wisdom, and practical advice. Joy is not dependent on external circumstances, they argue. It comes from within, nurtured by our connections with others. This collaboration highlights the universality of Tutu's message, demonstrating that spirituality can transcend religious boundaries to unite people in shared purpose. Segment 17. Speeches that moved nations. The power of oratory. Desmond. Tutu's speeches were masterclasses in rhetoric, combining eloquence, emotion, and moral conviction to galvanize audiences. Whether addressing crowds at rallies, speaking at international conferences, or delivering sermons in churches, he had a rare ability to connect with listeners on a profound level. His words continue to resonate, inspiring action and reflection long after they were spoken. "If you are neutral in situations of injustice," one of Tutu's most famous quotes, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor," has become a rallying cry for activists worldwide. First articulated during the anti-apartheid movement, this statement underscores the moral imperative of taking a stand against oppression. It challenges complacency, reminding us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. This phrase has been invoked in countless contexts, from pro-democracy protests to campaigns for racial and gender equality. Its enduring relevance lies in its simplicity and universality, cutting across cultural and linguistic barriers to convey a timeless truth. For Tutu, neutrality was not an option. It was a betrayal of humanity's shared responsibility to uphold justice and dignity. Nobel Peace Prize Acceptance Speech, 1984. Tutu's acceptance speech upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize remains one of the most powerful statements of his career. Standing before an international audience, he used the occasion to highlight the plight of Black South Africans and call for global solidarity in the fight against apartheid. "This award is not mine alone," he humbly remarked. "It belongs to all those who have suffered under apartheid and continue to fight for freedom." The speech blends indignation with hope, condemning the brutality of the apartheid regime while celebrating the resilience of those resisting it. Tutu's ability to evoke both outrage and optimism captivated listeners, reinforcing his status as a moral giant. Decades later, the speech continues to inspire those working toward peace and justice, serving as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light can prevail. Farewell Sermon, 2010. In his farewell sermon delivered at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town, Tutu reflected on his life and legacy with characteristic humility and humor. Addressing a packed congregation, he joked about his impending retirement, quipping, "I want to be remembered as someone who loved laughter and made people smile." Yet, beneath the lightheartedness lay a deeper message about the importance of leaving behind a meaningful legacy. Tutu urged his audience to carry forward the torch of Ubuntu, emphasizing the need for compassion, forgiveness, and interconnectedness in an increasingly fragmented world. "Do your little bit of good where you are," he advised, reminding them that change begins with ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The sermon served as both a valedictory address and a call to action, ensuring that Tutu's spirit would live on through those inspired by his example. Segment 18. Final Reflections. A life that changed the world. As we reach the conclusion of this extended exploration of Desmond Tutu's life and legacy, one thing becomes abundantly clear. His impact cannot be overstated. From his early days as a teacher and clergyman, to his role as a global advocate for justice and reconciliation, Tutu embodied the qualities of courage, compassion, and conviction that define true leadership. His unwavering belief in humanity's capacity for goodness continues to inspire millions, offering a beacon of hope in a world still grappling with inequality and division. At its core, Tutu's legacy is one of love, a love that transcends boundaries, heals wounds, and fosters connection. Whether challenging apartheid, leading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or advocating for global causes, he approached every endeavor with a heart full of grace and a mind focused on solutions. Love is stronger than hate, he often said, reminding us that even the deepest divisions can be bridged through empathy and understanding. Tutu's life challenges us to move beyond passive observation and actively engage in the pursuit of justice. He believed that everyone has a role to play, regardless of their background or resources. Ordinary people doing ordinary things can create extraordinary change, he reminded us, encouraging individuals to take bold steps toward a better future. Even in death, Desmond Tutu's voice continues to resonate, guiding us toward a more just and compassionate world. His example reminds us that change is possible when we come together with a shared vision of humanity. As we honor his memory, let us strive to embody the values he championed: courage, forgiveness, interconnectedness, and hope. After all, isn't that what true leadership looks like?